Hello everyone and welcome to our series of online webinars hosted by the friends, experts, winemakers and the sommeliers of 67 Pall Mall. We have a really full itinerary extending right up to the end of June and into July with some really exciting webinars planned. Later today we have Egon and Veronika Müller who will be joining us from their home right next to the legendary Schatz Hofburg vineyard, one of Germany's finest. Later on, I'll be speaking about the wines of South Africa, and then to finish with today, we will welcome back Dimitri Walters, MW, who will be presenting port wines. For now, Richard Hemming, MW, will be joining us from Singapore, where he will be guiding us towards some of the best quality wines with the value price tags available in the world. Please chat away on the chat box at the side, share with us what you are drinking and where you are drinking it. Make sure that you're set to all panelists and attendees so that we can see everything that you're saying. Also, if you can, please share on social media with the hashtag 67FromHome. As usual, we'll have 15 minutes at the end so you can ask Richard questions. Please write those in the Q&A box and not in the chat box if possible. So we hope you have a fantastic bottle of wine ready, and hello, Richard.
Hi, Ronan. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be bringing this webinar to you live from Singapore. What's also really nice is that we've got a nice group of people, including several regulars who often attend these 7 p.m. webinars here in Singapore, midday, of course, in the UK. So it's great to have you guys with us. For anybody that hasn't joined us before, I will briefly introduce myself. My name is Richard Hemming. I am a Master of Wine, and I am working with 67 Pall Mall in Singapore. The club is due to open at the end of this year. What you can see behind me is an artist's impression of what it's going to look like. Of course, with the current situation, we're not sure if that will happen on time, and we hope that we'll be able to pick up some time when the construction starts again. Anyway, in the meantime, we're delighted to be able to bring you these virtual events. And I have some promising news for anybody that has been inquiring about the tasting packs, which are being shipped out from our London office. You may have seen that the club in London, in 67 Pall Mall, is rebottling samples of wine and sending them out in packs so that you can taste along. And this has been going on in the UK and Europe for several weeks now, and we are trying to figure out how to get those packs out to Singapore. The promising news is that packs have now been sent and received in Singapore. The not so good news is that we are less than convinced that the integrity of the wine is still in place. There's a webinar tomorrow at 7 p.m. when I'm going to be testing of the packs that have been sent over. That's with LAS Vino from Margaret River. So hopefully we can get a system going whereby we can get the wines out to you. For anybody that is in the UK and Europe and has got the wines for tonight's session in front of them, fantastic. Please do taste those wines straight away at your leisure, work through them. I am going to talk specifically about those wines in the second half of this hour. What I've got in lieu of the tasting packs is a Muscadet by the producer that is in the tasting pack. That's Famille Liebeau. And this is a Clisson Muscadet from 2016. So a top level Muscadet that I'm going to be trying and enjoying myself as we go through this session. So first of all, I wanted to talk about what value really means, because you've got various different ways of defining how to find great value in wine. And one of the problems with wine is that it's ultimately all subjective. If I happen to think that a wine is great value at one price, then for me, I can justify it as good value. However, if you go down that route, then nobody would ever agree on anything. And actually that often can be the case in the wine world. But what I'm going to try and do today is work with the sort of common consensus of opinion. So I'm going to try and pick wines and define value in a way that I think most people would broadly agree with. So to define good value, you have to also define bad value, and everything is relative, of course. So you can have good value in a particular price bracket that may look bad value in a different price bracket. And I've got some examples of prices that I want to show you. So I'm going to put up just the first few slides today. So we're looking at how to find value in wine. So I'm just going to leave these on the screen here and let you think about what the price might be. On the left-hand side, there is a supermarket own label fruity red wine. Now, it is full alcoholic strength. It doesn't qualify for any kind of discount because of its alcohol level. It is a standard bottle of red wine. And on the right-hand side is a bottle of Domaine de la Romanée Conti 1988 Romanée Conti. Both of them are 75 centilitres of fermented grape juice. But what is the cost of each? If you want to have a little guess, that might be quite fun. Put it in the chat box as usual. And I'm going to reveal that in just a few moments, but I want to kind of just talk about relativity in terms of price. I'm assuming that anybody that's attending this webinar is already quite invested in wine and is likely to spend more than most other people would spend on wine. So you already have a value system for wine, which is different from the unengaged drinker, the kind of standard everyday, buy a few bottles at the supermarket, perhaps have a glass at the pub, that kind of thing. We've got one guess on the prices. This is good fun. So Christos thinks it might be £3.99 on the left for the Tesco Fruity Red versus £2,000 for the Romanée Conti 1988. Shireen Tan says likely less than $5. I assume that's Singapore dollars for the Tesco Red. These are all close. We've got $6 versus 115. So I'll come on to that in just a moment, but keep on going. Well, $7 for the Tesco and $50,000 for the Romanée Conti 88, Dominic guesses. Oh, this is great fun. These are incidentally prices that I took off the internet yesterday. They are real bottles for sale in real shops that people are presumably paying real money for. But what I wanted to say is that, you know, our values for wine as wine lovers are already different from everyone else's. So to a lot of UK customers, where the average bottle price is still under £7, you know, £5 or £6 is good value and £8 or £9 might be bad value. But what they're looking for is a simple, enjoyable red or white wine that they're not really going to think about. They probably don't particularly care where it comes from. They may not care too much what it's made from, so long as it is drinkable and they enjoy it. Now, of course, if you ask those same customers to go and buy a champagne, they would probably be spending 25, 30, 35 pounds in the UK on probably the best-selling branded champagnes, which are Moet, Nicolas Feuillatte, Veuve Clicquot, and so on. And automatically, they're spending much, much more money. Do they still think it's good value? I would imagine probably so for a treat. Or would an unbranded supermarket champagne at £10 be better value? Well, probably not, because people buy champagne for different reasons. They don't buy it as a regular daily drink. They buy it mostly for a celebration or as a gift. And so part of the value proposition for that is having the nice branding, it's having the gift box and so on. Here are the prices for these. £3.65 for the Tesco Fruity Red and £34,800 for the Romanée Conti 1988. And they've only got 8 bottles left at Hedonism in central London. So you know where to go if you want to spend a bit of money on some wine. Now, of course, I'm being flippant there and sort of ridiculing the price of that wine. For me, that looks like really terribly bad value. But there are people who buy it, and is it good value for them? It sort of depends on what world they're living in. If they are spending hundreds of thousands of pounds on private jets and fine art, then actually a bottle of wine at £35,000 starts to look arguably affordable. Now, these are extreme examples, but these consumers do exist in the world. We might argue about whether they would fully appreciate the wine, although it's really not down to us to say. But, it's all about where your spending zone is comfortably. And as Exotic Wine Travel have commented, it all absolutely depends. You're completely right. Everything depends. It is all relative. And yet, as I stated at the beginning, that's to a certain extent an unsatisfactory answer, because then you can never agree. You can never come to a conclusion. And I want to get to a place where we can say, this is good value on sort of objective terms. And I'm going to say that DRC 88 is bad value on objective terms. And my basic reason for that is that I've tasted lots and lots of great Burgundies. I've been very fortunate to taste DRC. It's among the best Burgundy I've ever had, but it is no way that much better than all of the other wines that we know at those kinds of prices. Now, I'm going to move on from that slide and show you the prices of those wines in Singapore. Now, actually on the left-hand side, it's not a Tesco branded, it's a Sainsbury's Cabernet Sauvignon, but that's effectively the same thing. You can buy that from a Singapore online retailer called Red Mart, and that is $18.90. And on the right-hand side, there's DRC Romanée Conti Grand Cru 1988 at $42,750. And that's from a retailer called the Oaks Cellars. Now, the exchange rate very roughly is 2 to 1. So already it's cheaper in Singapore to buy Romanée Conti 88 by quite a margin. So that's going to work out at, let's say it's £25,000. That's a saving of £7,000. Well, that's your flight to Singapore and back. You may as well do that, buy a bottle and just go home. Now, on the other hand, the Sainsbury's House Cabernet Sauvignon costs £4.40 in the UK. That's that reference there. So this bottle of wine here, let's say that's £10, roughly speaking, converting from Singapore dollars, yet it's £4 in the UK. So it's twice as expensive in Singapore. Does that make it worse value? Well, again, I'm afraid to say it does depend on what you're comparing it to. If you're comparing it to the price of living in Singapore, and if you're comparing it to other sort of daily consumable goods, then perhaps it's not such bad value because things are more expensive in Singapore. But if you're comparing it to UK prices, as I inevitably do, having only moved here 9 months ago, then yeah, that looks like really bad value. Obviously, this is a very big, broad spectrum, and somewhere in the middle is going to be the right sort of value that we want to think about. There's a few people commenting that Hedonism is a great shop, but there's a premium on the prices, and you're absolutely right. There is, and it's for the convenience of getting it. And the thing is, at those kinds of prices, money is almost no object. That £32,500 that bottle of wine costs isn't going to be the problem. It's going to be getting it immediately and in central London and being able to have it on the spot that people are prepared to pay for. And that's part of the attraction of hedonism. So thank you very much for joining in all of those guesses. Here's a few more prices, and this is where it gets a bit more complicated, I think. So Chateau Margaux is one of the top 5 wines of Bordeaux, if you're looking at the 1855 classification. And it costs £875 for the 2015 vintage. That's a lot of money. But Liber Pater 2015, which is, it's a Centimillion, isn't it? Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But that was released at the price of €30,000 per bottle, so about £26,000. Now, that price for a relatively unknown wine, albeit one with a very interesting story, I believe that they are making wine on ungrafted vines, which is very unusual in Bordeaux. But even so, you know, that price is extraordinarily high. And compared with Chateau Margaux, it looks to be extremely bad value. And yet, you know, Chateau Margaux and its stable mates in the top tier of Bordeaux are usually called extremely bad value. When you look at all the other great Bordeaux you can get, the second growth, the third growth, the Léoville Bartons and so on, at a fraction of the price, you think, well, why would anybody bother buying those top shelf wines other than, you know, branding and being able to give them as gifts, perhaps. And, you know, that is all part of what makes it a value proposition. What I'm trying to show you there is that depending on how you look at the price will affect whether you think it's good value or not. And the same applies for Grange. Now, Penfolds Grange is much maligned for the way that its price has increased over recent years. And those people who were able to buy it for, I don't know, £50 or £100 even a bottle from odd bins on the high street back in the 90s, odd bins being a well-known independent, well, not so independent now, in fact, it's kind of in dire straits, but it's, anyway, it's a high street retailer in the UK, wine retailer. You used to be able to pick Grange up there and it was, you know, relatively affordable. It still probably seemed expensive, but it was within the reach of a lot of normal people. And then it's gone up and up and up, and now it's close to £500 a bottle, and people are saying, well, that's terrible value. But have you even heard of Chris Ringland dry-grown Shiraz? I hadn't until recently, but it's twice the price. And it was made, as I understand it, for the American consumer primarily, designed to appeal to a very particular style with lots of extraction, lots of luscious oak, lots of intensity. And you know, to people who have never heard of Chris Ringland, as I hadn't, there's absolutely no point in, there's no value in paying nearly £1,000 for a bottle of his Shiraz. Whereas, you know, virtually everybody's heard of Grange. And is £500 now quite good value for one of the world's greatest wines? You know, and that I think is one of those moments where I can draw on popular consensus. Virtually everybody would agree that Grange, year in, year out, is one of the world's great expressions of Shiraz. I've tasted quite a few different vintages. Some are better than others, for sure. But it nearly always has a really impressive, special, delicious character. So I think that you could argue that Grange is better value in that context. So it basically depends on how you're looking at things. Now, I'm going to move on to, excuse me, I'm going to move on to those wines in a moment, but I just wanted to kind of talk for another few minutes about how to find value that is going to apply to most people, most wine lovers on a kind of day-to-day basis. We're not drinking Liber Pater and DRC and Grange every day. I hope we're not drinking Tesco Fruity Red every day either, but I haven't tasted it. I can't pass judgment. The point about a wine like Tesco Fruity Red is that the value systems that you apply to it, you know, don't have any relevance to what we want from wine. It's not going to be a wine that expresses place or grape variety. It will be made to extremely industrial standards. That's just a necessity. And it really primarily serves a purpose, I would argue, as a vehicle for alcohol, first of all, hopefully, which isn't too unpleasant to drink. And in fact, you know, technically, wine can be made very well at a very cheap price these days. Who knows, maybe it is serving a purpose. It's paying some growers who would otherwise have to let their grapes rot. But what we want to look at is the kind of mid-range of wines and think about how we get value from those, how we define value, where we can find it, and what we would compare it with when discussing what makes good value. So I'm just going to have a sip of this Muscadet because that's going to bring me perfectly onto one of my value regions. So that's delicious, by the way. Unusual style of muscadet, but perhaps I'll come on to that in a moment. There are reasonably well-known regions that offer good value for money. Portugal, Spain, South Africa. Those are three that come immediately to mind. So what is it about those countries that allows them to offer largely really good value wine? And in this context, what can we say that value is defined as? That was a bad sentence. How can we define value? And incidentally, to Omar, I am drinking a Clisson Muscadet from Famille Lieubeau. I will come back to that. By the time I've had a few more glasses, I'll be able to pronounce the producer's surname. So South Africa, Portugal, and Spain are three countries where you can get really good value. Why? Combination of reasons. It's reasonably cheap there. You know, there's a lot of vineyard land, labor costs are low, production costs are low. So you can grow relatively good quality grapes for not much money. Compare that to, for example, England. Now, I was talking with Gavin Monnery in the webinar on Monday about urban wineries, and he was talking about the price of grapes in England. And he was saying that good quality Chardonnay to be made into a still wine from England costs about the same as Premier Cru Burgundy. So there's no way that these small UK producers can sell bottles of English Chardonnay for much less than 20, 25 quid. And some of them are selling it for a lot more. Now, most people, because again, referring to kind of the consensus of the wine world, would say that £25 for an English Chardonnay is not good value. And why do they say that? Because there's so much great Chardonnay around the world, not least from Burgundy. I mean, there's loads of great Chablis you can get at that kind of price. But then, you know, look at South Africa, for example, Australia, obviously, New Zealand. At those price ranges, there are so many great Chardonnays available at £25. So fixed costs are one important reason that determines eventual value. And if you've got relatively inexpensive overheads, then obviously you don't need to charge as much. But that's only one factor. Another factor is demand and availability. There's an awful lot of wine made in Spain, especially. And selling it all is not easy. You know, generally speaking, there is a lot of wine sloshing around that needs a buyer. So prices inevitably go down because, you know, there aren't enough people wanting to buy this wine. I think a similar thing can apply in a lot of different countries. Whereas if you look at the demand in Burgundy, because that's a really convenient example, for the best producers and the best villages, demand is outstripping supply. So the price of grapes goes up, the price of the wines goes up, allocations come into play, and all of these things affect the price of the wine. So we've got the fixed costs, we've got the availability, the volume of the wine being produced and the demand for that wine. And then we've got fashion, simple as fashion. That can seriously influence the value of a wine. So is New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, which has a famously higher standard price point than, say, Chilean Sauvignon Blanc, is that always objectively better? Is New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc better than Chilean Sauvignon Blanc? I would say the answer is no, it's not better. Some of them are, some of them aren't, but you know, there are lots of countries that can make wine that has the effectively identical characteristics of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And that is not to disparage Marlborough Sauvignon, but it's a reasonably easy wine to make. It's a reasonably inexpensive wine to make. And yet the premium for Marlborough is purely down to fashion. Fashion is related to marketing. It's a more desirable region. You could argue the same for Provence Rosé, which tends to be more expensive than, say, Côte de Rhône Rosé. Grapes are the same, regions are the same. If you get a good quality Rhône Rosé producer, it'll cost you maybe half the price of Provence. But people aren't just buying Provence Rosé because of where it comes from. They're buying it for the label, for the marketing, because it's the trendy thing to have. So value is all related to those things. If you want to go and impress people and have, you know, and you're bringing a rosé, then if you're bringing it in a magnum and it's from a trendy Provence producer, especially if it's the, you know, the Brad and Angelina domain, whose name now escapes me, I'm sure someone will point that out, then, you know, you're buying that wine not simply for the flavor. Mirabelle, thank you. three people immediately saying Mirabelle, and one person saying Moravia, which could just be a suggestion for the region. Sorry, I haven't been able to keep up with the with all of the chat, but it's lovely to see some of your comments there. I'll try and get to them. And don't forget also, if you do have questions, please do put them in the Q&A box, because that's what I'll look at when I go through the wines later. So, sorry, I got as far as saying, let's just take, for example, South Africa, Chile, Portugal and Spain. But of course it doesn't stop there. If you want really great value Chardonnay, do you go to Burgundy? Probably not. Might you go to the Jura? Yes. What about Limoux or even the Languedoc? Those regions are making some Chardonnay that is, I think, objectively better value. It provides a lot of the same characteristics and complexity that you can find in Burgundy. And, you know, in blind tastings, I think would prove itself the equal of many, many Burgundies. But people don't buy wine blind. They buy it because it comes from a particular place. They have an emotional connection to it. And all of this is building up to me coming onto the wines and talking about, you know, their intrinsic qualities. When you study wine for the MW course, you define quality by balance, length, intensity, and complexity. So I'll sort of take those four factors as a way of arguing that these wines are really good quality. And then at the price, when you compare them to other wines of a similar nature, they are great value. So what we're getting there is quality price ratio, the all important QPR. What is the best quality you can buy for the lowest price? And like I said at the beginning, for people like us who are already engaged with wine, have hopefully open minds, are willing to try lots of different things and are curious about what you can find out there, that's where the real interest is. It's in discovering great value wines that are underrated and undiscovered. And then of course, you know, who knows, in 30, 40 years, these wines, which are currently now really great value, might end up being incredibly expensive. To take Burgundy as an example again, we just saw the price of Romanée Conti being in the tens of thousands of dollars or pounds or whichever currency you want to pick. 20 years ago, I reckon people would have been saying, oh, that Burgundy is expensive. Yeah, it's not really very good value now. Let's not buy that Burgundy. And that was 20 years ago. And now look at it. It's only going to go up. I think if you look 10 years in the future, £35,000 for a bottle of 88 DRC is going to look like good value. So you've got to look at time as well. Now, of course, that's impossible to predict, but many of you will be familiar with the trends for Riesling and sherry in times gone by, where those wines were the same sorts of prices as top Bordeaux. Now, of course, Riesling is hugely undervalued, although the prices are going up, and I think that's promising. But sherry, you know, great, great sherry can be picked up for tens of pounds, 10, 20, 30 pounds. And these are some of the most unique and enticing wines of the world. And they are great value, but do people want to drink them? Is that the kind of flavor that people are going for? Unfortunately not. So that's why they're good value, because the demand is so low. All right, let me put my slides back up. So these are the 6 wines that I chose as something I think is a really great value wine. So I'll give you the list of 6 and then we'll go through them one by one. So we have a white wine from the Douro in Portugal, the 2018 vintage of Altano, made by the Symington Group. Wine number 2, I really hope you're familiar with Semillon from the Hunter Valley in Australia. This is Mount Pleasant Elizabeth. Now, there are loads of great Semillons, but the thing I particularly like about this wine is that it's the 2009 vintage, and it's been cellar released, late released. So it's deliberately held back and then released with bottle age. Number 3 is Lieu Beau Chateau Thébault Muscadet from 2012. And so that's the same producer as the wine that I've got, but I've got a different cru, the Clisson, and I've got the 2016 rather than the 2012. But I know this producer's wines reasonably well, and I'm confident that they're all of a good standard. And Muscadet as a category. If you think Riesling's undervalued, people talking about Riesling there. My goodness, poor old Muscadet. Number 4, a wine that I think a lot of people will be familiar with, Guigal's Côte de Rhône. I've written up Guigal's Côte de Rhône so many times because I'm just amazed at how good it is at the price consistently year in, year out, especially considering the volume they make. And I'll come on to that because I happen to know how many bottles of Guigal Côte de Rhône is produced every year. Number 5, perhaps much more obscure, Cien y Pico, which means 100 and something, Doble Pasta from Manchuela, and that's the 2015 vintage. Now that's a pretty obscure wine from a pretty obscure region, not very well known, a great candidate for value, therefore. And then number 6, back into the Douro for a wine called Porta 6 from the Lisboa region. And this is a wine that's really widely available in the UK, sold by Majestic Wine, but also sold by one of the supermarkets. So this is a good example of a great value wine that is easily accessible, because that's something else that I think is important in these discussions. Okay. The Altano Branco is 12.5%. It's £9.95 in the UK, and it's $26 over here. It's sold in cold storage supermarket for anyone based in Singapore. And a couple of months ago, it was on sale for $21. So that was pretty much the same as the UK price. It's a blend of those grapes. I mean, that's not the kind of thing you're going to see written on the label. Malvasia, Viosinho, Rabbigato, and Moscatel Gallego. And actually, it's the Moscatel that is one of the characteristics, the grapes that gives it quite a distinct character. That's the bottle shot, and I'm sure you know where the Douro is, but it starts here and flows inland, goes all the way up into Spain somewhere, around about here. And the Douro Valley, most famously makes port, which is another great value category when you think you can pick up true vintage port for around £100 a bottle or less even. And these are wines that will last for decades. And they've had to turn their attention to making dry table wines simply to keep afloat, because the demand for port is so relatively low than it used to be. There's a lot of grapes that are now being made into table wines, and Altano is a great example. And it's just such a fantastic wine. The reason that I think it's so great, $9.95 isn't especially cheap, but what you get for this wine is so much more than I think most white wines at £10 can offer. Because you're not just getting a sort of straightforward, obvious varietal. You're getting a blend of varieties that really expresses the place. I think this really tastes like a Douro wine. And I'm not sure why that is. I'm not claiming it has a kind of reflection of its soil type especially. Certainly the climate will have something to do with it, because it's got really ripe flavours and yet only 12.5%. That's one of the things that the Douro can do really well, is achieve flavour ripeness at lower alcohols, for their whites especially. Good natural fresh acidity. And it's just a really, forgive this slightly lazy expression, but it's a really vinous wine. It's textural, it's not overtly fruity, it's savoury, it's appetising. It's a really versatile food wine. I just think it's really delicious. And I think when you look at what else you can get for around £10 or $25 in Singapore, I think that is one of the very best value wines. It's from an underrated region. It's interesting. It's the kind of thing that wine lovers will really focus in on. Wine number 2. Let us know, by the way, if you're tasting those bottles and you have any thoughts, please do let us know in the chat. Wine number 2 is a Semillon from the Hunter Valley. This is 10.5% alcohol. In the UK, it is available at the outrageously low price, I believe, of $11.99. And in Singapore, $63, which is quite a bit more expensive. That's actually through a retailer who I believe would ship it in from Hong Kong. So it's not actually kind of landed in Singapore at that price, hence why it's a bit more expensive. I've made a note there that it's an unoaked wine, and only because Hunter Semillon with bottle age is very often mistaken for oaky wines because it develops characteristics associated with the flavors of oak, which are spiciness, vanilla, maybe pencil shavings. And those characteristics come purely through the aging of the fruit in the bottle, of the wine in the bottle. And it's really remarkable as a category, Hunter Valley Semillon. It is hugely untrendy. I mean, even in Sydney, I'll show you actually where it is. This is a blown up map of the Hunter Valley, but hopefully you can see down here. Here's Sydney, so we're looking at southeastern Australia, the state of New South Wales, and probably 2 or 3 hours drive north of that is the Hunter region. And these wines are not trendy really anywhere. They're very difficult to sell, but they mature in this extraordinary way, bringing these toasty, vanilla spiced characteristics that are just really complex, really intense, really lengthy, really delicious. And again, you know, at that price, £12 UK, around 60, let's say, to be more fair, perhaps it would be around $50 in Singapore, but what else could you get with bottle age that has matured properly at that price? I would argue nothing. I think, well, actually maybe Muscadet would be the other thing you could consider. White wines that can seriously age at that price are very, very rare. And of course, Riesling ages incredibly well. Would it be that cheap? I doubt it. I doubt that you'd be able to get to buy off the shelf a 10-year-old Riesling at that kind of price. Could be wrong, and you know that's another reason why Riesling is a great wine, a great value wine. But Hunter Valley Semillon is just so overlooked and so underappreciated. And this Mount Elizabeth is particularly inexpensive, but you know, you look at Tyrrell's Vat 1 or the Lovedale Semillon, and there are loads of different producers who are making these great Semillons every year. And none of them are massively expensive. I mean, Tyrrell's is probably the most expensive at between 40 and 50 pounds a bottle. And to a lot of people that will look expensive, but I think for a wine that ages so well, you know, what you're getting there is a level of complexity and maturity that makes it great value, because it's not just about, you know, a wine that's kind of expressing its place or that has a particular characteristic of variety. You're now looking at bottle maturation, and that is a rare commodity. And so to get it at those kind of prices, that is good value. I'm going to use this wine as an excuse to take another sip. I mentioned earlier, I was going to say that this wine is kind of unusual, and I think the same will apply to the 2012 that some of you will be tasting. It's unusual because it is from one of the better sites in Muscadet. Muscadet are going through a system now of developing separate crus, so named villages, named vineyard areas, which produce better quality fruit, generally speaking riper fruit, and generally speaking with longer on the lees. So this wine that I'm tasting had 30 months on the lees, and the 2012 had 36 months on the lees. So the wine that you're looking at on the screen there, the Chateau Thébault is the cru. Mine is Clisson. Clisson is a granite terroir. I don't know about Chateau Thébault. 12% on the wine in on your screen. And here's something that's kind of slightly curious. You might be able to just see there that this is 13%. Sorry, my background keeps on making it disappear. 13% alcohol. Is that legal for Muscadet? I always thought it had to be 12.5 max, but perhaps they've changed things for the accrue system. Anyway, don't tell anybody because, you know, we don't want to get these guys in trouble. They're making great value wine. My point is, look at the prices there. Another mature wine at £14. Now, the reason I said that this was different, unusual to regular Muscadet, is that the ripeness and that lees age brings much, much more richness. And in fact, it's kind of atypical for your expectations of Muscadet. It's a bit like drinking Grand Cru Chablis. There's a time and a place, and I don't think I'd ever turn it down. But Grand Cru Chablis can really be quite different to what you expect when you talk about Chablis itself. So often the case, and actually this brings us back to value, that the wines at the top of the pyramid, the wines which are most expensive, that have had the greatest exposure, that have had the most extraction, the most new oak, are bad value. Because all of that effort doesn't necessarily translate into a better wine. So that's quite intriguing. And I think some companies use that as a sort of marketing tool. They will have their top wine, their icon wine, their Grand Cru or whatever it might be, and they will use that to make the rest of their range look better value. You know, they will take a selection of their grapes and bottle it as a single vineyard selection or a barrel selection, so on, charge a huge price, and suddenly the rest of their wines look better value. And we saw that earlier, didn't we? We had a look at Chateau Margaux 2015 for £875. And when you say it like that, £875, it's a lot of money for a bottle of wine. But when you put it next to a wine that costs £26,000, could you argue that it's better value? This is my point, that, you know, everything is relative. And what we've got here are still very inexpensive wines. They're delicious, but not especially typical for what the traditional expectations of Muscadet are. So maybe you might want to look at their even cheaper wines. And we're only talking £3 or £4 less, or in dollars, probably, you know, $10 less, to get what is their regular Muscadet, that's going to be much more what you expect and is even better value, arguably. There's Muscadet. So that's a kind of close-up of the whole of the Loire, and the Muscadet region is coastal, just around here. And we've got a map coming up of the whole of France to make it clearer to show you where Muscadet is in case you're not familiar with it. Let's move on to some race. Now, I mentioned Guigal's Côte de Rhône, and I told you I know how many bottles they make. It'd be quite fun, actually, if there are any guesses. Let's do any guesses again. Let me know how many bottles of Guigal's Côte de Rhône Rouge you think are made every vintage. Let me know in the chat, and I'll talk about the wine otherwise. 14% alcohol, $10.95, or in Singapore, $36. So, you know, not such good value when you compare those prices. Aged 18 months in oak. Now, that's quite an unusual length of time for a wine that's relatively inexpensive. And it's also unusual that it's 50% Syrah. I think technically that's not even allowed. Whenever I've spoken to the Guigal family about this, they've told me that, you know, strictly speaking, that you're not allowed to have that much Syrah in it, but they do it anyway. And, you know, of course, most Côte de Rhône is Grenache based. So this is a Syrah-based blend. I just think it is such a brilliant expression of the Rhône. It's ripe, smooth, it's got complexity, spiciness from the Syrah, it's got garrigue character, herbal character. Very recognizable. I think it would, I'd be really happy, I think, if I got that in a blind tasting. Don't quote me on that. But it's a super wine that I've written up lots of times. I've tasted loads of different vintages. It ages really well. This is the current vintage, I believe, the 2016. So they don't release it until it's mature. That's another really nice thing, because you've got a wine with a bit of bottle age, quite a lot of oak maturation. That develops the wine, brings it more complexity, so that when it comes to you in the glass, it's already sort of ready to go. It's already developed. The answer, some people have got it. The answer is 2 million. I found out that statistic in 2017. So maybe it's gone up, maybe it's gone down. But yeah, 2 million bottles sold at £11 a time. The Guigals are doing all right, but long may they continue. You know, they're buying grapes from hundreds of producers, of growers, and they're blending it together. They're managing to make a wine that is superb value at high volume. I think that is an incredible feat. I mean, of course, the Champenois do it all the time. So why shouldn't it be possible for a Rhone producer? So here's all of France, and we're looking at the southern Rhone here. So even though Guigal is based in the north, up here, he makes all of the Côte de Rhône from Syrah and Grenache and Mourvèdre grown in the south. So all of that wine comes from the south. And a reference back to Muscadet. So Muscadet is just here at the mouth of the Loire. So yes, Guigal's Côte de Rhône, a wine that I will happily buy at 10 to 15 pounds, or you know, in Singapore, $30 to $40, and think that I've got a really good wine. Somebody's found my article when I wrote it up. In fact, that was a 2014 vintage. Yes, so if you want to read what I thought about it then, please do go ahead. Very kind of you to share that. Thank you, Roy. Siena Pico, Doble Pasta, Manchuela. So Manchuela is the region in Spain. I've got a map of Spain coming up, and I'm going to try and find Manchuela. I'm not entirely sure where it is myself, and that kind of speaks to something, doesn't it? This is an appellation which is incredibly untrendy, not very well known. It is made from 100% Garnacha Tintorera, which is also known as Alicante Bouschet, which is a non-trendy variety, famously a Tenturia variety, which has red flesh. Most black grapes have white flesh, but Alicante Bouschet, Garnacha Tintorera, has red flesh, and consequently the wine is a very intense, deep colour. £11.59, again for a wine that is already 5 years old. This wine I've loved for many, many vintages. It's made by an Australian winemaker who also makes wines in McLaren Vale under the Dandelion label, which you may have come across. And they've got that kind of Australian clarity of fruit, but with a very European savoury characteristic. And they are just delicious, I think. So let's see if we can find Manchuela. I think it's somewhere around Castilla-La Mancha, because that's right in the middle. Oh, there it is, look, Manchuela, yes. So, you know, the kind of middle desert bit of Spain, where, you know, there are not very many trendy names around there. These are not producing wines of high commercial value. I think that's a really lovely label, screw capped. And just, if you've never come across it, please put it on your list. For value, again, you know, at the same kind of price, all of these wines have hovered around the same kind of price, around the 10 to 15 pound mark. It is absolutely on the sweet spot. It is so complex. I served this at my wedding. Did I say that already? I served this at my wedding. And it's a real crowd pleaser because it has that kind of Spanish softness. Like most people like Rioja, very broad brushstroke thing to say, but it's generally tends to be true. This has the appeal of Rioja, but it's a very different style. It doesn't have that overt oak character. It's just absolutely fantastic. It's delicious. And then finally, another Portuguese wine, a red this time, from the Lisboa region. Again, I'm going to have to try and find that on the map. 13% alcohol, but look, £6.50 in the supermarket. So this is at the average price that people pay in the UK for a bottle of wine. So I'm guessing over here in Singapore, that would be, if we were lucky, that would be $20. And this, for me, has got to be the best buy at that price. Again, it's a wine I've tasted off plenty of vintages. It's 50% Tinta Roriz, 40% Castelao, and 10% Touriga Nacional. You know, a pretty straightforward blend for Portugal. And it delivers, again, that characteristic that you get from good value regions, whereby it isn't just straightforward varietal fruit. You're getting a sense of place. It tastes that it's got that kind of Southern European ripeness to it, and yet the alcohol isn't too high. It has a real savoury, appetizing edge. It's another good food wine. So Lisboa is down here, isn't it? Yes. So the Lisboa region, I don't think is marked itself on the map. I can't see there. But anyway, you know, it's around the town, the city, the capital of Lisbon. So that's another great example of good value wine. So, you know, 6 wines there. Now, I am choosing those wines because I happen to really, really like the flavors. And this brings me back to something that we were talking about before. You know, it is to a certain extent subjective. If you don't happen to like the flavor of Muscadet or Hunter Valley Semillon, then those wines are not going to change your mind, because I think they're real exemplars of those styles. But my point is that at the price, I don't think there are many wines that you can say have got the same balance, length, intensity, and complexity, those characteristics that define quality. I don't think there are many other wines that you can find at that kind of price. So I've got about 10 minutes to answer some questions, and I can see that we've got some already in the box. So I'm just going to run through these now. If you've got any more, let me know, and I'll see if I can catch up with some stuff in the chat as well. So, first question. What region do you think creates great value for money, fine wine, not just good quality, but wines that are profound, complex, and age-worthy? Well, the first one that comes into my head is the Moselle in Germany, because, you know, that is a classic combination of wines that are not only age-worthy, fine wines, but they're really unique. Even for Germany, there is something about Moselle Riesling that is just fantastic, that it is so age-worthy, so obscure in its flavors, very esoteric, and therefore, you know, a really good candidate for aging and fine wine at a really very affordable price. So that would probably be my first choice. Are there any others? Are there any for reds? Great value for money, fine wine. I'm sure there are. I mean, there are bound to be. The Loire, Cabernet Franc, some great age-worthy fine wine coming out of there. Some of it getting a bit more expensive. I mean, you could argue that there are great fine wines from the Northern Rhone, which is still relatively cheap. It depends what you're comparing it to. But I'd much rather have, you know, great Cornas or Saint-Joseph than Pauillac, personally. Another question. Any advice on selecting merchants for great value wines? Also, any useful blogs for relatable value wine selection? I can't think of any blogs which really focus on value itself. I have been contributing to jamesrobinson.com since 2008, and we have a database of hundreds of thousands of tasting notes. And you can search for the term GV or VGV to find great value or very good value wines from the tasting note database. And that is a resource I use all the time. If I want to find a great value example from, you know, any appellation or grape variety, then I use those terms. So I think that's a pretty good resource. Of course, you do have to be a subscriber, I would say, but you can do a free trial, 3-hour-long trial. You can just sign up for that on the site. So that's worth a look. Merchants for great value fine wines. I mean, in the UK, it's the Wine Society. They are hands down the best value merchant. Out here in Singapore, I'm still getting used to how all of these things are sold. So it's much harder for me to say, so I'll pass on that one. But perhaps somebody might suggest some things in the chat. Another question from Shireen Tan. What are the great value countries / regions for classic wines like Chardonnay, Pinot, Cabernet, Merlot, and Syrah? Great value countries and regions for those. And I assume, therefore, we're talking about kind of beyond the obvious, like Bordeaux and the Rhone, and Burgundy, because, you know, you can find value in those places. It is still possible to find, especially really, really good value Bordeaux, just from the Bordeaux appellation, for example, or from the Haut-Medoc, perhaps. But where else would I look for really good value? For Pinot Noir, this came up actually when I did my Pinot Noir session. Eastern Europe, there are some outstanding wines coming out of places like Romania. I used a wine, a Pinot Noir, which is £10 from the Auvergne region. The appellation is called Côte de Puy. I might be slightly misremembering that. Puy de Dôme, I beg your pardon. and it's made from a cooperative there, and it's a fantastic Pinot Noir at the price. So that's somewhere to look. For Syrah, well, I mean, I love Syrah from New Zealand, from Hawke's Bay especially. I think those wines are fantastic value. Again, you know, they're offering Rhone quality complexity, albeit in a slightly different style very often, at half the price or less. More questions. Jackie says, what do I think of supermarket own labels in general for value, such as Tesco Finest, Sainsbury's Taste the Difference? Does the volume the supermarkets buy assure value in these wines? Ooh. Well, I mean, that is, of course, what they're aiming for. Supermarkets are trying to buy wines in high volume that are better than their competitors. You know, they love it when they win awards, or when they can say that it's scored a certain number of points and they can get one up on their competitors. Are they best in class? I don't know. It's very hard to say. I think they often can be, but unfortunately, I don't think it's something you can say generically that they always are. It's probably on a case-by-case basis. It depends a lot on how good the buyer is, perhaps just on how good the vintage has been in that country or for that variety to a certain extent. But I have no prejudice against those wines. And I think they're probably, you know, at the kind of those premium levels that we're talking about, Finest and Taste the Difference, they do a very good job very often. Time for a couple more. Mark Yang asks, would I say then that in Singapore with that price, the Guigal Côte de Rhône is no longer value for money at $36? Well, I mean, I wish that it was only 20 or 25, you know, simply by kind of doubling the UK price. And yes, I think when you know how much you can buy that wine for, $36 doesn't look like brilliant value. However, I've had much worse value for money wines at that price in Singapore. So I stand by it that, you know, I think for its reliability and its complexity at the price, it's still okay value. Maybe not great value, but I still think it's acceptable value. What do I think of the use of wine critics ratings to look for value wines? So as in, you know, looking at the scores that critics have given and then seeing if it's value. Yeah, I mean, if your tastes align with that critic, then fair enough. I think that can work. And, you know, ideally critics should be tasting blind so that they're just literally assessing the objective quality of the wine as far as they can. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good rating. It obviously comes with a pinch of salt. Some critics are perhaps more reliable than others, and I will name no names. Time for a couple more, I reckon. Which region in the USA, asks Xia Chen, makes quality wines of better value? Well, that's a hard one because, you know, if you try to look outside California, for example, you go to Oregon or Washington or New York State even, the wines aren't actually good value. The wines are actually quite expensive. Now, that's not the case for all of them. I mean, Washington State is churning out some pretty good Riesling, for example, at pretty good prices. But I think you'd probably look to California. You know, there's just so much grown there that you can still pick up good value stuff. Will you find it in Napa Valley Cabernet? No, you probably won't. But if you look at slightly more unknown places and you look at perhaps a bit less fashionable varieties, you may know the Bedrock Zinfandel wines. They're made by a master of wine in California. And they are probably around 20, 30 pounds a bottle, but they just deliver so much complexity and intensity. And they're not just kind of cliched Zinfandel that's jammy and overripe. They're real wines of nuance, and they're really delicious. So, you know, there are bargains to be found. As with all, you know, good value stuff, if they were easy to find, they probably wouldn't be very good value anymore. So you do have to do a certain amount of digging. Final question from Stan. Is there any chance to find wine for €1? It's actually a good question, and the answer is unfortunately probably yes. When you go to a lot of cooperatives, you can buy wine on rack, you know, in bulk, and they will just open the tap and you can fill up your 5-litre can with wine, and it probably is €1 a litre. And certainly I know that wine is sold for less than that in the bulk market. You know, the cheapest denomination of wine, which gets into those kind of supermarket Tesco fruity red wines for $3.65 a bottle, those are being sold for incredibly cheap prices. So that brings us to the end of the hour. Thank you very much for those questions. That was a really interesting one. I mean, I've obviously, like anybody, I like to find good value stuff. So I hope that that's been useful for you, giving you some ideas for where to look for your next bottles. I've very much enjoyed this Muscadet. Sorry if I wasn't able to respond to everybody, but thank you for your comments in the chat. Join me tomorrow, same time, 7 p.m, when I'm going to be chatting to Nicholas Peterkin, the winemaker at LAS Vino in Margaret River, a young winemaker who's making some fantastic wines, interesting blends with Portuguese varieties, with Chenin Blanc. And he's going to be telling me about his wines. We'll be tasting through them together. So I very much hope to see you then. And until then, good evening and thank you. Bye-bye.